Thanks, Kripa. So I'm assuming you all showed up here today because you're the sort of people who are up for disrupting the status quo with purpose to create something better. And this is a critical in-demand trait in 2021 and beyond because we're at this pivotal point in history. We really have to carpe diem this thing because if you're familiar with research around change, you'll know that change always follows a specific pattern. We start off in the status quo, it's familiar, comfortable, business as usual, then something external disrupts us, which throws us into a period of chaos and volatility until we accept the change, learn from it, and create a new, higher status quo. A new normal, a new paradigm ready to be disrupted. This means that right now, having lived through the chaos of the past year that isn't over yet, together we face the single greatest opportunity of our generation to positively disrupt the way we work, to create a step change in the quality of our organizations, the environment, and our lives. And in truth, this goes way beyond me and you and our organizations and growth and productivity and profit. Because all the scientific evidence suggests that the decisions that we make in this decade alone will determine whether the world remains stable enough to provide decent well-being for future generations to come. That's why the Nobel Prize Summit just declared a state of planetary emergency. More specifically, there are 9 environmental processes that regulate this stability. So within these boundaries, there's a high chance of good well-being and prosperity. But moving into the yellow zone, which you can see we already have in some areas, it brings uncertainty and danger. Then moving into the red levels, we have a high chance of reaching tipping points that take us irreversibly away from the ability for our ecosystem to provide social and economic well-being. And these are challenges that we can solve. And I believe that reinventing the way we work with a great sense of urgency and with all the imagination that we can muster will not only help us reduce our carbon footprint, but will give us the bandwidth that we need to rise to the responsibilities, the wider responsibilities that face our generation. And I hope in the next 20 minutes I can cover enough ground to explain why reinventing work brings not just hope or a facade of doing something, but a practical foundation for creating stability and shifting towards a regenerative economy. Whether we deplete or nourish, whether we destroy or regenerate, it all depends on our courage and our skill as designers, designing new ways to live and work and create, and in recognizing our limits as designers, because we don't have all the answers, and therefore the need for bold, prolific experimentation, trying stuff and learning what works. So disruptive design as a method can make this happen so that you and your fellow innovators can amplify your influence and serve as agents of change. So here we go. You can think of disruptive work-life experience design like a prism, only technically in reverse. All the different teams that normally operate in different wavelengths, when brought together by the disruptive design method, form a bright, focused light of an outstanding experience. You might notice that I included marketing on here. That's just a suggestion because marketeers often have customer experience design expertise that's useful to apply internally. But you can add whichever teams you like to your version of the prism. What we're aiming for here is beyond incremental improvement, which is just doing the same thing a little bit better. We are shooting for disruption, creating something that is so much better that we can't believe we did it the old way for so long. And that, in a nutshell, is what disruption is about. Buckminster Fuller put it beautifully. He said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the old model obsolete." So how do we do this? How do we build a new model of work-life experience, a new model that's better suited to the realities of today and tomorrow? Well, before we get into this 3-phase method, I'm going to show you that will answer that question. Let's get a few things straight about what the realities of today actually are. Firstly, I say work-life experience because work and life are no longer separate. Yes, there's a lot of talk about work-life balance and boundaries right now, and I get it, but I believe a bigger issue is thinking of work as only productivity, like producing and stuff, ticking things off our to-do list. And from that frame of mind, learning, exploring, mentoring, having conversations that aren't directly tied to business goals, and even thinking can seem separate from work, like something for our spare time, like extracurricular activities. And too often these activities are marginalized or sacrificed almost completely. So I think work-life experience involves a radical change of work patterns, approach and attitudes so that we normalise the integration of longer-term views, deeper potential stretching aspects of life into our working day. Secondly, all roads point towards mass adoption of hybrid working. We have realised, lo and behold, that companies are actually just a bunch of humans trying to get stuff done. And we humans all have different life circumstances, different preferences, different roles. So when you see the world through this lens of individuality, then applying a broad brush social norm like 9 to 5 working in an office at your assigned desk seems at best suboptimal and at worst absurd. We've learned from the pandemic that the vast majority of people want to spend roughly half their time in the office and half at home. This is a consistent research finding. We've also learned that very few people want to work from home 100% of the time. And we've learned that there's a disconnect between employee and employer expectations. In fact, Microsoft listed 7 hybrid working trends in a recent report, one of which was this: leaders are out of touch with employees and need a wake-up call. Their report says over 40% of the global workforce is considering leaving their employer this year, and 46% is planning to move now that they can work remotely. So organisations that don't pivot fast enough towards more human work patterns, including hybrid working, they just won't retain their best people, let alone attract new talent or inspire them to do their best work. Then there's the looming collaboration crisis. Again, according to Microsoft, we're spending double the amount of time in meetings than we did this time last year and sending 40 billion more emails per month. Here's an eye-watering statistic that the cost of meetings in just 2 countries, the US and the UK, stacks up to a staggering $457 billion every year. And unproductive meetings are a top cause of low employee satisfaction. So it's the perfect storm of anxiety, crazy amounts of time in meetings, drowning in email, working longer hours, missing social contact, economic instability, job insecurity, health worries, exponential change. And this leads to what researchers call threat rigidity. Threat rigidity occurs when anxiety triggers a desire for control and a focus on yourself that leads to a go-it-alone mentality. So people become more risk adverse and less collaborative, less creative in a crisis, which is the exact opposite of what we need right now. This pulls directly against our efforts to boost collaboration and innovation. Just take a look at this chart. This is data from a law firm that was part of a Harvard study looking at 10 years' worth of data on collaboration, and it paints a very typical picture. This is during the 2008 crash, and it shows that the most collaborative workers grew their business and continued growing beyond the crisis. The mediocre collaborators declined during the crisis, but they did start to recover within a year. But the poorest collaborators hunkered down, stopped networking, guarded their clients, hoarded work, and as a result, their revenue contracted. And 5 years later, the poor collaborators still hadn't recovered. So the work-life experience needs to facilitate collaboration, increase trust, reduce anxiety, encompass mass personalization to cater for individual needs and circumstances. It must reduce waste, wasted time, energy, carbon footprint, budget. This is a complex challenge. But let's start with some basic assumptions. First, the workplace needs to be adaptive. It must adapt to user needs that are continuously changing. Secondly, utilization data is essential for optimizing an adaptive hybrid workplace. Without this data on who's using what and when, whether it's rooms, spaces, parking, classes, equipment, what mix of people are attending meetings virtually versus in person, without this, it's almost impossible to know whether your work-life experience is well configured to your current reality. So you end up making decisions essentially in the dark. Utilization data is particularly important if you're currently figuring out the best way to reduce your real estate footprint, or if you're planning to keep the same footprint but reconfigure the space, perhaps adopt activity-based working. Now imagine most of you will be looking at doing one or both of these things to some extent, so you'll need data to reveal which spaces are over or underutilized. And thirdly, we can assume that the office and everything in it needs to be accessible on demand. Or in other words, your desks, your meeting rooms, focus booths, equipment, services, whatever facilities people need for a productive day's work should be bookable in advance. Because if everything isn't bookable in advance, there's no way of generating accurate utilization data. There's no way of efficiently managing occupancy. So you'll potentially end up with big peaks on a Monday, nobody coming in on a Friday, or people showing up at the door only to be turned away. There's no way of automating health and safety procedures like social distancing, health checks, and contact tracing. And of course, you can't deliver a world-class experience if you don't allow people frictionless access to what they need when they need it. Then there's the issue that I know many of you are grappling with, which is that most people no longer need an assigned desk. Organisations I've been talking to are aiming for a ratio of 2, 3, 4, 5 people per desk. Other companies like Dropbox are taking an even more extreme approach, shooting for 0 desks. They're seeing their future offices purely a space for collaboration and socialising. In fact, they're calling it Dropbox Studios. They're not even calling it an office. So clearly, any great work-life experience must factor in all these elements. It must be adaptable, data-driven, and on demand. And finally, it must also be personalised. We've seen into each other's bedrooms over the past year. We've had Zoom meetings with clients' cats. I think we're well aware at this point that every human has a unique set of life circumstances and work preferences. So we should design for the few and not the many. So now we've established some key shifts that are underway, let's get stuck into the disruptive design method. Because it's all very well having technology and data and strategies and tactics, but we need to manage all that stuff. We need to conduct the orchestra. To do that, we need a framework, a scaffolding to support and galvanise our efforts. So disruptive work-life experience design is a 3-phase method for activating change. It's inspired by the work of Dr. Leila Ajaralu, a sustainability innovator, as well as the design thinking process that many of you may be a little bit more familiar with. If it helps you remember the 3 phases we're going to go through, the acronym is ACT, A-C-T. Phase 1 is A, adoring the problem. That might sound a bit weird, but we can't underestimate the importance of getting excited by the problems that we're trying to solve, getting really curious about them and helping our teams do the same. Because our brains are hardwired to avoid complexity and discomfort. We all experience this resistance at times, so we need to push past that by immersing ourselves more deeply in the problem. And the more experienced we are, the easier it is to slip into the trap of expertise. You know, this assumption that I get this, I know what to do. In truth, the most obvious ideas aren't always the best, and things are always more complex than they seem on the surface. For example, many smart people thought open plan offices were a great idea to increase collaboration, only to find out that they have the exact opposite effect. As Peter Senge said, today's problems are often yesterday's solutions. Likewise, no amount of well-being initiatives that treat the symptoms of burnout will cure an underlying leadership problem that's causing the burnout in the first place. So we need to dig beneath the surface so we can avoid jumping to conclusions and to avoid focusing our efforts on sticking plaster solutions that treat the symptoms rather than the causes. Now, you can do this on your own with a couple of colleagues in a big cross-functional group, but start by writing down a statement or question that defines the problem area you want to tackle. For example, it could be broad, like creating a transformative workplace experience in a hybrid working world, or a little bit narrow, depending on your area of influence. For example, how can we give our people autonomy and trust while controlling building occupancy and safety? Now, once you've defined the problem, come up with a research plan that fits the resources, time, and budget that you have available. Now, you might have employee engagement survey data, pulse survey data, third-party research, peer-reviewed studies, employee interviews, case studies, utilization data. Now, all of this, layered on top of the knowledge, the experience and training that each of you brings to the table, feeds the wisdom of the group. It fills everyone's brain with fresh content so that they can have more meaningful, useful insights later on. So as you're immersing yourself in research and data, you'll discover lots of things, lots of parts that constitute the problem that you're looking to address. So start by capturing and noting down all these elements, or nodes if you want to call them that, as they'll form the output you need for phase 2 of the method. You can do this by making lists of elements, using sticky notes or pieces of paper for each element or node, using online tools, however works for you. In fact, it's really important to remind yourself and your team that there's no right or wrong way to do this. This whole thing is a thinking exercise, so just let it take you wherever it takes you without getting hung up on whether you're doing it right. You might want to start at a high level with big concepts. For example, here I've got autonomy, occupancy, safety, mental health, carbon footprint, commute, building security, job security, collaboration, and so on. Then drill down further and further into the detail that isn't visible at a high level, going as deep as you can to zoom in and out between your helicopter view and your worm's eye view, in and out. Then once that's done, you've identified all these bits and pieces, you can shift on to phase 2, C, connecting the dots. Now, you generated lots of components, elements, nodes, things, or whatever you want to call them in phase 1. Now it's time to start drawing connections between these parts. You can use all kinds of techniques for this, like systems mapping, identifying feedback loops, cause and effect diagrams. In fact, if there are any systems thinking nerds here today, you'll be on fire at this point. But let's keep things simple for now because we've got limited time by starting with a cluster map. So just throw all your nodes down on a big piece of paper or a glass wall or a virtual whiteboard, however you're doing it, doesn't matter, and start arranging them in whatever way makes sense to you, identifying connection points and drawing lines between nodes that connect or influence one another in some way. Now, during this phase of the process, you'll find you're creating an absolute mess, but you have to be okay with that. The objective is not to end up with a pretty picture that makes sense to a random outsider. You're not going to present this. Rather, the objective is to spark fresh thinking within your disruptive design group. As I said, it's a thinking exercise. So it helps you reveal the connections between pieces of the workplace, work-life experience puzzle that aren't obvious at the start. So once you've got a big messy picture of all the parts, all the connections, you can start circling connection points that had a key insight for you, because it's at these connection points that you typically find the place to intervene with a creative solution that will have disproportionately massive impact from a relatively tiny tweak. And it's these points of leverage that we're after. Then finally, you can move on to the third and last phase of the method, T for test and learn. This is the ideation phase where you're going to come up with potential solutions to try out or to show people in order to get feedback. Now, it's easy to fall into the trap of getting stuck on your first idea or your first few ideas that you have at this point. But again, the most obvious ideas are typically not the best. So go into this by setting the expectation with your team that you're going to push through the complexity, push through the comfort zone, push past the obvious ideas that come out early on. You might want to set a minimum number of ideas per intervention point that you've identified, say 5 or 6, to help you do this. Also be prepared to cycle back through previous phases, because chances are you'll have to dip back into your research. You might even have to redefine the problem area that you're tackling, reconsider the resources you have available. So this doesn't have to be a linear process. You can and should loop back and forth. The goal is to end up with ideas that you can prototype. Now, prototype doesn't have to be a physical prototype. It can be anything that you can get feedback on. So it could be a flowchart showing employee journey changes. It could be an outline for a new training initiative. It could be a hot desking or an office neighborhooding pilot. Your aim is a minimum viable solution that allows feedback so that you can test and then learn. And that's it. It's a simple 3-phase method for working through complexity to activate change. Adore the problem, connect the dots, test and learn. And all that deep diving, adoring the problem, pulling out the nodes, connecting the dots, spotting the intervention points, rapid prototyping. It makes everyone feel more fascinated by the work-life experience. It gives rise to this sense of empowerment and of personal agency. And that's really important, because without a sense of agency, we feel helpless and we don't act. Paul Mitchellman, the editor-in-chief of MIT Sloan Management Review, put it really clearly. He said, "We, as in society, have reached a new level of angst. Taken together, today's attacks on our sense of personal power across all walks of lives and our economy amount to a crisis of agency." And that's the last thing that we need right now. And developing our sense of agency, it's not the only unexpected benefit of using this disruptive method. There was a brain imaging study by Duke's University that showed that problem solving, which is the whole point of disruptive design, actually buffers the brain against anxiety. According to 2019 research by Thrive Global, anxiety costs over $46 billion a year in the US alone. And we've already mentioned the knock-on effects of anxiety on threat rigidity, collaboration, innovation, and success. So teaching your team or department, or even better, a cross-functional team, or even better, your entire organization, this really simple 3-phase method, not as a one-off, but as an iterative, ongoing process, it can have a really profound systemic impact. You might have seen this kind of diagram before. It portrays a classic agile iterative process. And in this case, it shows you can leverage utilization data to optimize the workplace experience. Well, now we can layer our disruptive design process on top of that to accelerate the speed at which we evolve as our comfort zones expand, our spheres of influence expand. So using this process, or your own flavor of it that you develop as a way to iterate and innovate the work-life experience, you can surreptitiously achieve the dream that we've all talked about for ages but struggle to make real, which is true cross-functional collaboration. where departments are no longer in silos, but they blend into one another around the challenges that they're tackling together. And that's not all. You can also achieve the other dream we've talked about for years but have struggled to make real, which is creating a learning culture. What better way to learn than to immerse yourselves in all the components of a problem area and work through it with diverse colleagues? Many of you at this event today are leaders, you're decision makers. And as great leaders, you naturally leap to thinking, how can I fix these problems for our people? As if it's your job, this top-down job. But I'd argue we need to move beyond this static top-down way and instead make evolving, adapting, and problem-solving everyone's job. In fact, the job is far too big for it to be any other way. When we use processes that have learning built into them, we can create lasting positive change, because change actually happens at an individual level. Everyone needs their individual light bulb moment. If you've read James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, he points out that too often we mistakenly believe that massive success and radical transformation require massive radical action, when actually it's the small, regular, consistent improvement that can have the most astounding impact. That's why habits have such a dramatic effect on the course of your life. By implementing new routines that are actually quite easy to accomplish, you create this system of compound growth. As James says, you get what you repeat. So I'd urge you to think about disruptive design as a thinking and doing habit, a routine. And it's the routine part that's more important than the ins and outs of the method. In fact, feel free to rip up this method and create your own one. Throw out the rule book, forget best practice, and focus on best principles. Because what matters is that you're interrupting business as usual, that you're involving everyone in the journey, and that you're creating space for learning and thinking and continuous iteration. You're creating time. Time is a non-renewable resource. And just look at our working lives. Look at our to-do lists, our strategies that never get executed. Look at our long-winded approvals processes that stifle action and innovation. Look at the hundreds of millions of meetings that we have every day. We have no mental bandwidth to tackle problems that lie beyond our own noses in that environment. And lack of mental bandwidth, that creates a focus on short-term needs. It creates blind adherence to legacy systems, including modes of work that were designed decades ago for a completely different world. I remember reading some research that studied Indian sugarcane farmers, who were interesting because they were quite rich at one time in the year when the harvest had happened, and quite poor at the other time of year after that money had run out. And what was interesting, that it turns out that when they were at the difficult time of year, their thinking abilities dropped by the equivalent of 10 IQ points. In fact, there are loads of studies that show that people aren't poor because they make bad decisions. They make bad decisions because they're poor. And this mental bandwidth problem doesn't just apply to poverty. When we're time poor, when we're anxious, our mental bandwidth is reduced. So the point is, we better free up some bandwidth. We better build this in as a vital component of the work-life experience that we're shooting for. And this means looking at well-being, productivity, and innovation in a much more holistic way. The earth needs to be a safe place. Our organizations need to be a safe place. Our homes and our heads need to feel safe. From that foundation, we can take the massive action that's needed to address the most important scientific discovery of our time, which is that we have pushed the Earth beyond the boundaries that have kept it stable for the last 10,000 years, since the dawn of civilization. And of course, take the action that's needed to redesign our organizations and our jobs continuously in the face of change, not least that which is accelerated by technology, as we strive to create adaptable, agile structures that are a better fit for the 21st century. And all the easy stuff in the world has been done, so this is going to be hard. But humans are smart. Humans can do hard stuff, so long as we share a sense of purpose. In fact, doing hard stuff is a serious business, but it's also a lot of fun, Let's see what we can do here. So I'll leave you with one final thought. And that is that real transformation is what the ancient Greeks called metanoia, meaning a change of heart or perspective. People who experience for themselves a different way of seeing things are transformed with a new sense of purpose and a new way of being. That's what Einstein was getting at when he said we can't solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. If we don't embrace tools and frameworks that help us see things in new ways, we risk getting stuck in a rut. And from that rut, it's very unlikely we'll create a work-life experience that inspires a new way of being, a renewed sense of purpose, a better quality of life that is sustainable. And I mean sustainability in the widest sense of the term, doing things now that won't screw up our quality of life in the future. So I wish all of you well on your quest to create the perfect conditions from which not just a sustainable, but a regenerative, inspiring work-life experience will emerge. Thanks very much.